All right. First thing, I know Halloween's coming up. You guys are probably starting to think about Halloween costumes. You're gonna try to pull off the Campbell look. All right. You're gonna need beanie, oversized shirt that's inside out because the seams mess with my Versailles. Compression socks, Crocs, and I'd like to say that the socks match, but that's a lie. It's early in the morning. I'm trying not to wake up my wife. And I just grab. So sometimes they match, sometimes they don't. So that's option. That's an optional accessory. Okay. So that segues perfectly to what I'm going to start off today's lecture with. And that's apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. Which one does not belong? So far, we've had motions that were flexion and extension in the fetal, out of fetal. But I was remiss, I think I'm using that right. Me and English don't get along very well. When we talked about the knee, we had this new motion that I didn't expand on enough. I mean, it's not going to take long, but plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, two different forms of getting in the feet. But when we got to the knee, we talked about a new kind of motion called internal and external rotation and or lateral medial rotation. I told you how things are synonymous with each other. And I think it's important. I wish I'd have known this when I was an undergraduate student. If joint motions are rotations anyway, why do some motions get the R word of rotation in them and others do not? Like why have flexion and extension and then internal and external rotation? We're going to see that with the cervical and the trunk too. Like we're going to have like flexion, extension, right, left, lateral, bending, and then right, left, transverse, circle, rotation. Why does rotation? And that's because those motions are more pure rotation spinnings. They're spinning like the merry-go-round, right? So when we have motions that aren't as general, remember when I said like flexion, the reason we don't say forward back, because my hand's going forward for the first part, but then if I keep flexing, my hand's going to start to go back, right? That's general motion, a combination of, but the spin is still the same. However, when we get into internal and external rotations, that's more pure spin. That's like more of the merry-go-round kind of movement. So think of it like this. When I flex, my head goes forward and down. When I bend to the side, my head goes to the side and down. But when I'm looking to the right or the left, it's more like pure spin, if that makes sense. So that's why some of these motions have rotation in them. In fact, it should be like, oh, that motion has rotation in it. Probably it's transverse plane like a merry-go-round and more pure rotation. Make sense? Practical example. If I had dumbbells in my hand, right? Let's say really heavy dumbbells. So for me, 20 pounds. This is work. This is work. You know, it's not work doing this one all day. Right? It's different. Similar but different. General motion, more pure rotation. Okay. All right. Let's go to more detail of the hip. This is our first example of ball and socket. I'm going to play with the shoulder and the hip excessively because they're both the same classification of joint. They're obviously two different joints, but they're the same class. They're the same class. Shoulders, though, are more visual. Like I can do things with my shoulders that I can't necessarily do with my hip because of my lack of range of motion. So just know that like some of these examples, all I'm doing is just raising it up here to kind of show you more visual. The hip is composed of 4 bones, guys. 4 bones. I try to give it to you on your materials. The ilium and the ischium and the pubis are fused that form the socket, the acetabulum. Right? So again, the acetabulum isn't a bone. It's formed by the fusion of 3 different bones. Think of it like when I have some family in Texas, and there's areas called the Arklatex. Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. Those are 3 separate states, but the area of that corner of the 3 states is called something. Similar. You have 3 separate bones that help to form. And you know, if you're curious like me, you're like, why are there 3 separate bones? Well, when we're baby, like we take time to develop 18 years, some a little more, women maybe a little less. But we take time to grow out our skull and grow out some of these bones. And then when we start growing, then we can seal them up and fuse them. But if those bones didn't have growth plates to allow them to grow, our sockets, our little baby sockets could become adult sockets. Kind of makes sense. And then once you're done growing, they can, weld them shut and hopefully you're good to go. And then the femur. The femur articulates with the socket formed by those three bones, the initial pubis. Before we get into motions, I want to demonstrate a very unique feature that you're going to be introduced to. I feel like I'm doing a puppet show. Our hips, our right and left hips, are connected via what we call our pelvic girdle. You guys have heard of shoulder girdle, pelvic girdle? It's a term used for all of the different articulations. So like our left shoulder girdle is like our sternoclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joint, glenohumeral joint, that's our shoulder, and the scapula. I can independently move my left shoulder girdle from my right. I don't have to move them together. If my left goes up, my right doesn't have to do anything. If my right goes forward, my left doesn't have to do anything because they're two independent, separated entities, my left and my right shoulder girdle. That's not the case right here. Your left pelvis, the left side of your pelvis is called hemipelvis, but your left side is connected via the sacroiliac joint to your right side. There's a little bit of play, just a little bit, not enough to cause significant motion, but I can't take my right side of my pelvis and do this with it. That doesn't sound good. I can't take my left side and do this with it. Does that make sense? The way I try to explain it is your pelvis is like the foundational bedrock that your skyscraper, your spine, is built upon. Right? Think about it. If you're going to have a skyscraper with all these different, it's $5 a home. If you have these skyscrapers of all these floors going up and up and up, don't you want to have a foundation to build that on? So this has to be stable. We don't want this to move like this. It's not. It doesn't have the same purpose. Here we need mobility to do what we do, but down here we need stability. Okay? That offers up a very unique set of features. Sound like what was that movie Taken? That movie with what I do possess is a very particular set of skills. So if I move my left knee, doesn't have to affect me, right? Left ankle doesn't affect my right ankle. When I move my left hip, I don't necessarily have to do anything to my right. But what's very interesting is when we do the Uno reverse card, meaning when I have what we call open chain. I'm not going to ask you that on the test. It's just it's moving like it's supposed to. The small piece moves about the big piece. This is how the clock's supposed to move, right? That's how we're used to the clock move. No big deal. But when we move the clock about the clock hand of the hip, the other side socket has no choice but to move. Think about that for a second. Trying to put it into practice. Clock hand on the right side could totally move independently of the clock hand on the left side. However, if I move the clock on the right side, the left side clock has to move. That doesn't mean the other side's hip has to have joint motion, but the clock has to go along for the ride. Does that make sense? So for that reason, it would be here would be an example. Let's pretend I have two clocks and I do our classic this question on the test, right? Okay. My right hip had this, no problem. Got that? All I'm saying is that the left hip's clock just did this. There was no joint motion, but the whole clock on the left side, like, have no choice but to have some motion from the other side because they're splinted, they're connected. Okay. Eventually, starting on Wednesday, I'm going to teach you that when we move both sockets like that, we have terms for those things called pelvic girdle rotations. Because I can't independently move each side, they have to spin from a perspective together. And that's going to be important because we have our mobility of our skyscraper city from our legs but we also have the stability of our skyscraper from our pelvis. So the pelvis is a very fascinating midway point between hips on the bottom and trunk on the top. It's pretty cool. The analogy that I'll give is like a basketball. A basketball can't spin itself, but I could spin it with like my hands on the bottom. In fact, I could spin it with one hand on the bottom. That would be like my right hip, the other hip on both. Or I could palm the basketball and move it like this on the top. That's like our trunk. Okay? So before I get into these hip motions, I'm forewarning you that it won't be like knees and ankles in that we can have these hip motions. Looks like it's moving, and it is. That's great. But when we have the illusion stuff, we have to also not just look at it from the joints perspective, but how is that pelvis? And I teach it in different ways. I give different analogies that work to different people, like a bucket that can be pouring water out the front or out the back or the right side or the left side. And so now we're getting into the area of the body where there's a lot of things that are starting to kind of merge and are hidden with our clothing that aren't out there in the open. Like when I was playing baseball back in the day, way back in the day, and I started working softball as an athletic trainer, I was fascinated with the illusions that our pitchers would throw, and I started thinking about all these different things and why. When we would pitch, there's now not me, I didn't throw very hard, but when we release the ball, it's out here, right? When my girls would throw the ball, it was like some Harry Potter magic, man. Like, because they're throwing it close to their body, so it was hard to pick up the ball. I mean, they'd throw it, I'd be like, whoa, where did that even come from? That's kind of what I'm trying to say. Once we kind of start getting into the body, things are just not as obvious as they are distally. Once we start coming proximal, but I'm going to teach you the clues. I'm going to teach you that there's clues in the clothing. It just a little bit different, but just trust me. We're going to get through this, okay? But this is where the stuff gets fun. The second thing I need to emphasize before we get into specific motions is perspective of a perspective. Let me try to give you an example. In my shoulder, if I start off in anatomical position and I say, okay, every bone in my body is facing forward, front, back, right, left, up, down, proximal. If my shoulder, my arm, my humerus, let's say my little bicep is facing forward, I do this and you say right shoulder flexion. Great. But what happens if I externally rotate first? We're going to learn what that is, but we learned that in the knee. Got that? Well, now my bicep's facing laterally, right? Facing out. So now the conundrum is, what if my humerus does the exact same thing it did for flexion? I mean, think about it. bicep goes forward. I do this, my arm is like, dude, in fact, what if I did this to try to show my point? Is that flexion? Well, to my humerus, it's like, I did the exact same thing as you did the first time. So that's why articulating bones, planes of motion, sagittal and frontal. Notice, those are the two planes where we have general motion. Easy. Sagittal and frontal are going to be from the socket's perspective, from the proximal perspective. And there's a reason for that. That is so that flexion, getting into fetal, and lateral flexion, as I'm going to explain a little bit, still have the same meaning. In other words, it doesn't matter if I'm internally rotated. It doesn't matter if I'm externally rotated. Flexion is going to be in the socket sagittal plane because that's going to get me more into fetal. The transverse plane is going to be owned by the long bones, like the femur and the humerus, so that we can have internal, external, regardless of what sagittal and frontal position we're in. It doesn't matter. The long bone is spinning about its polar axis. Think of it like this, guys. When you start to get into the most movable joints, we don't live our lives in 3 dimensions. Well, we do, but we don't really think about it. It's like in biomechanics when I say our brains aren't meant to think curvilinear. We're think to think linear. I get $20 an hour. I work 2 hours. I get $40. Like our brains are meant to think linearly, not exponentially. In a 2-dimensional world that we live in, we don't go up and down very often. So it makes sense that if I'm trying to get to a certain place, and let's say I'm trying to go to Eunice, my GPS says, well, it doesn't matter if you go north first and then west, or west first and north, you're going to get to the same place. When you add the 3rd dimension of up and down, sequence matters. I'm going to give you an easy example. If I rotate my body forward first and then spin my body to the left, A, then B, okay? This is the position of Kindle. He went forward, he spun to his left. But what happens if he spins to his left first and then goes forward? He's in a totally different position. When you start incorporating that 3rd dimension of spin, sequence matters. We do this first, then we do this, then we get to the same place, right? So this helps us to keep into perspective that the rotations that we're going to see are from the long bones perspective, the distal bones perspective. And the flexions and the extensions and the lateral flexions, I'm going to teach you that that's ab and adduction, is from the socket's perspective. It doesn't matter what the long bones perspective is. And so that way, this is still abduction, just like this is still abduction. This is still flexion, just like this is still flexion. Make sense? Okay. So let's get into these basic motions. The first ones we should know by now. In the fetal, out of fetal, flexion, extension. We should be comfortable with those by now, right? The other one we should be comfortable by now with the knee lecture is internal and external rotation. We have a precedent for that. Hey, left knee, spin laterally or externally. Hey, left hip, spin laterally or externally. Left hip external, left hip internal, left hip lateral, left hip medial. When we fix the clock hand and move the clock, it's going to look like this. Left hip external, left hip internal. But notice, when I'm moving the socket, the right side of my pelvis has to go along for the ride. I'm not saying my hip has to have motion, but it's impossible for me to have internal rotation of my left hip and my right side not go somewhere. Whee! The tricky part, I've tried to do it a few times, one hip at a time. Your brains are going to have a tough time. It happened with the knee. It's not your fault. It's just how our brains are wired. When we rotate both hips at the same time, initially it's going to be confusing to you. But I'm going to try to use landmarks. I always try to use landmarks, not global landmarks, local landmarks. Here are my anterior superior iliac spines, your hip bones. When I externally rotate my left hip, my kneecap, I say, well, why don't you just say my foot? Well, I could do it with my knee flexed and then I don't see my foot, right? So it's really about what's happening at my femur and the socket. Luckily for me, my kneecap has to be attached to my femur, not directly, but indirectly, right? So when I do this, my left hip, notice my kneecap is lateral to my anterior superior iliac spine. That means I'm externally rotated or laterally rotated. When I do this, my kneecap is lateral to my ASIS. That means I had to have the same motion. When I do both hips at the same time, it's going to mess with you like a batter. When this is their lead leg, their plant leg, and they do this, your instinct is going to want to say, oh, that must be lateral or external rotation. This is internal or medial rotation. Because you were taught, well, when my left side goes lateral, that's external. But your instinct wants to say, well, anything on the left side that goes lateral must be external. No, not if the clock moves about the clock hand. Make sense? Where did I start? Anatomical. Where did I finish? Is my kneecap medial or lateral to my socket, to my ASIS? It's medial. I had to have internal rotation for those of you that can't see it. I started and I finished. My kneecap is medial. But your brain wants to say that's the same spin as lateral. Your brain wants to say, well, if this is lateral, then this must be lateral. Does that make sense? Your brain wants to say, well, if this is lateral spin, then this must be lateral spin. That's like saying, if this is counterclockwise, then this must be counterclockwise. You see what I just did there? I do it for my students on the right side. Your brain wants to say, well, if this is counterclockwise, then this must be counterclockwise. And those are two totally separate spins. Yes? Okay. Everybody stand up. If you're willing and able. But I think this is going to help you. I think this is going to help you. For those of you watching at home or watching it later, stand up. All right, that's what we're going to do, guys. Feet shoulder width apart. Thumbs anterior superior iliac spine. Remember, this is on your pelvis. This is on your sockets. What I would like for you to do first is put your weight on your right leg and externally rotate your hip. Keep your thumbs facing forward and notice how your feet are lateral to your left thumb. Cool? That's external rotation. Okay, come back. Now what I want you to do is spin your pelvis to your right. Do you see how your left feet are lateral to your thumb? Those have to be the same motion, is what I'm trying to get at. Okay? All right, let's do them both together. Both thumbs, both feet on the ground. Rotate your thumbs to your left. I need you to be able to identify what type of rotation the left hip had and what type of rotation the right hip had, and they are not the same. I need you to be able to see how my left hip was internally or medially rotated, and my right hip was externally or laterally rotated. Does anybody not see that? Okay, come back. Last one, I promise. I know this is awkward, but you're not on camera, so it's okay. Come back. Spin your thumbs to the right. I need you to be able to see how your right hip is now internally rotated and your left hip is now externally rotated. All right, have a seat. You're all like, interaction stuff. So. I would do it with the lights off so you'd feel more comfortable, but then you couldn't see your feet. Does that make sense? We're going to practice. Just know this is the reason it messes with your brain, is because your nature wants for everything that spins lefty to loosey, and your brain wants everything that spins righty to tighty. And that's not how human motion necessarily works. I can have lefty loosey if I move the green, but I can have righty loosey if I move the brass. Does that make sense? Like, they have to spin in opposition is what I'm trying to get at, to get to the same place. Cap and bottle. I open it by spinning the cap lefty loosey, but I could also open it by spinning the bottle righty to righty, righty loosey. All right. So that's internal and external rotation of the hip. Now let's get to ab and adduction. Hopefully I'll make this as easy as possible. Guys, I don't know how else to say this, but ab and adduction had to be named, like, they have to name things something. But I can't help but think that the person who named these two motions was Satan. Because, like, flexion, extension, at least don't start with the same letter. Internal, external, medial, lateral. Ab and adduction, like, come on, dude. And with someone like me who has dyslexia, come on, dude. Like, really? Can we not call it like George and Bob or something? So what you end up having is confusion based on how similar the words sound. You may know the difference, but just those two words sound so close. It's like from my biomechanics class, kinetics and kinematics. One deals with motion, one deals with forces, but they sound so close that sometimes it's easier to confuse them. I graduated high school with a set of twins. They looked nothing alike. They were what they call it, fraternity twins. But their names were Heath and Keith.